Hey guys, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is Grade 1, Lecture 8, and in today's class we're going to be discussing the somewhat untalked about topic, I think, of float betting the flop. Now, many of you will have heard the term float before, but you might have only heard it in the context of calling a bet. But I guess the more modern definition of this word is actually used in the sense of betting when checked to by the preflop raiser, betting when checked to as the preflop caller. So today is going to be about how to concoct not just a strategy, but also a completely logical and bulletproof protocol or thought process for solving these interesting decisions on the flop, where the preflop raiser checks to us and we have this chance to bet. The good news is that this class will have wider influence on the rest of your game, as a lot of the concepts discussed here on range construction actually affect how we're going to play our full strategy in many other betting opportunity spots. So the implications of this lecture are a lot more than just this one node in which we introduce the concepts. But first, what is a float bet opportunity? The opportunities we look at today happen in position after the preflop aggressor has checked on the flop to the preflop caller. The most common one that you're going to get in a single raise pot is going to occur blind versus blind. And the reason for this is that most single raise pots that are played out of position by the raiser happen in this configuration. There are some others, such as cutoff versus button, under the gun versus button, and 6-max cash that can happen as well. These are a bit more dependent on your opponent playing a calling range preflop in the first place, and in today's games, a lot of people tend to simplify to a 3-bet or fold strategy preflop, which obviously makes it impossible that you ever play against a cold call range. However, weaker players will cold call a lot. Some regulars do choose to build cold call ranges preflop. I choose to in certain spots actually. And so you will come across other ones, but blind versus blind like this is going to be our staple for today. It's the most wide range and tricky situation preflop. In a lot of ways, relative hand strength is really quite different in this matchup compared to what it is in a more standard sort of cutoff versus big blind spot where ranges are a little bit more tight and familiar. So if you're not that used to playing 6-max cash, like if you're coming over to this format of the game from something like live full ring, you will not have played this situation very often, and you may not be that familiar with just how crazily wide ranges get here. So I think it's a really nice starting point. It's somewhere between 6-max and heads up actually. If you're a heads up player, you'll be already like familiar with ranges of this width. But yeah, as always, when we're building a betting range, like in a situation like this is big blind here, where we've been checked to by the preflop raiser, we're going to be polarizing to some extent, bearing in mind that the extent to which we polarize is up to us and depends on how favorable the landscape is for us and how much betting we want to do overall. But when we contract our range by betting instead of checking, there's always going to be at least some polarizing effect as long as we weren't betting all of our range. And the thing about being a preflop caller is that you don't tend to have the sort of massive range advantage necessary for betting all of your range. So you are pretty much always splitting your range up and polarizing it to some extent. So as a warm-up exercise, and with this vague consideration in mind that ranges contract in the direction of polarizing when they choose to bet, I'd like you to try and solve the following warm-up exercise for each of these 8 hands. Try to decide which are bet more frequently and less frequently. Which hand you think is bet the most often in game theory, which hand is bet the least often, and try and rank them. I'll give you a few minutes to do that now. Maybe get a pen and paper or some kind of place that you can type and write them out in order of most bet to less bet, remembering that polarization is the guiding factor when you're building a betting range where you're not betting everything. Okay, I'll assume that you've done that. Here's the solution. Our goal here is not going to be to memorize exact frequencies. We are going to look at some snippets from a solver output, which does display betting in terms of exact frequencies, but we have to understand that this is just something we should be trying to model as a guideline. We shouldn't be trying to recreate the exact betting frequencies of a solver, but the main idea here when float betting the flop, the basic premise is that we'll be betting hands that are more polarized in nature. This means usually very high or very low equity, more often than we'll be betting hands with medium equity. Now the exception to this is draws, because while a straight draw, like 5-6 here, has medium equity, it has more equity than a total airball. It has less equity than a made hand like pocket 8s. But while it's medium equity, it's also going to do a lot of betting because the nut potential is going to drive that hand to crave bigger pots, survive well in bigger pots, and also benefit from showdown value because the equity comes in the form of stuff that usually doesn't get there. So showdown value is very valuable to a hand like 5-6. Other than that, hands with mediocre equity that are based on having a made hand, ace high, king high, these are the hands we're going to expect to do the most checking, right? These mediocre hands that do not derive much of their mediocre equity from nut potential or improvability. So let's have a look at this on a spectrum. The hands that are bet the most often here are these two. They're always bet. In fact, they're the only pure bets, meaning 100% bet frequency of the 8 hands that I gave you at the start of this exercise. Jack 7 is perhaps easy to understand because it's a very nutty looking hand. And as we know, when we're in position, the urgency with which we want to approach our investment ceiling and start building the pot with a very strong value hand, a tier 1 hand like this, is very high. I will say in general that paired boards are a little bit weird in that when you have a pair, you're going to simultaneously block your opponent's strong hands that can call you like their weaker trips by having that card. I'll also say that on a paired flop, obviously there's still 1-7 left in the deck here, so it's nowhere near as good a hand as having something like a set on an unpaired board, or even having 2-3s on this board here. Sets are much stronger on unpaired flops than trips are on paired flops for that reason. And trips are therefore usually less mandatory to bet immediately than a set is, because the hand just runs out of value a little bit sooner and does a worse job of unblocking stuff that it's getting called by. If you have like a pair of 5s and the flop is king 5-3, you're going to unblock all of the king x in the deck apart from king 5. So it's easier to get paid off there. Hands that are betting very often but not all the time are hands like pocket 6s. Pocket 6s is a thick value bet. Note that 6s does not have as high an investment ceiling as a hand like Jack 7 does, and therefore it's not racing to get the money in from as early a juncture in the hand. You can slow play 6s here, unbeknownst to most people. Most of you out there never slow play 6s here. How do I know this? Because I'm psychic, I can see you right now, I'm watching you, I've been watching your play for a while, I'm just kidding. I know this because I've taught loads of people like you, taught tons of people at this level of tuition who haven't studied a ton of GTO and don't really know which spots are mandatory to value bet and which spots are merely optional. And this one with 6s is definitely optional. The reason being is that this hand doesn't crave such a high investment ceiling that it has to go at the pot building immediately. You also don't need to harvest protection, although protection is one of the bonuses of betting. It's just one of the good things about betting. There are good things about checking too, and it's not the case that you need protection here. That's why I don't like the word protection. It sounds like something you absolutely have to have when you don't. If you check back here and your opponent hits the turn with Jack 10 and you lose a pot, a medium-sized pot, you lose 2 bets, that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. You didn't let him get there because he only got there this one time, and when he doesn't, you actually make more money by checking than by betting. Queen 10, this is another hand that you might never bet if you're being super selective and you're thinking, okay, I need some kind of gut shot here to start bluffing, and you're being extremely negative about how good your hand needs to be to bet. Having 2 really good pair draws is absolutely sufficient here. The queen is also not a card that's giving you a ton of ability to win at showdown. If you had a hand like king 10, there'd be a lot more checking. King 10 is very close to the median of your range, but queen 10 is below that. So very live pair draw hand, and hitting a queen or a 10 will obviously be really powerful, especially in a wide range late position battle like this, where it doesn't take a lot of absolute hand strength to have a very strong hand, relatively speaking. So both of these are frequent bets in Equilibrium. Ace 7 is bet a surprisingly low percentage of the time. This isn't the solver telling you, oh, it's way worse to bet Ace 7 than Jack 7 here. It's just saying that while Jack 7 is a mandatory bet and needs to get value urgently, Ace 7 can actually slow play more successfully, i.e. the EV difference in theory between betting and checking this hand against a strong balanced opponent is 0, but with Jack 7 there's a slight gain in favour of betting. Why is this? What explains this phenomenon? You may have noticed the ace blocker. The ace blocker is actually a very bad thing here. Well, not a very bad thing, but a fairly pessimistic, negative thing when it comes to trying to get value. And the reason it should make you more pessimistic about your ability to get value is that it blocks a big chunk of your opponent's calling range. When the small blind raiser, the guy that raised tons of ace-x pre-flop, along with other things, but widely concentrated into ace-x, his range there, when he checks the flop, he's going to essentially be check calling at quite a high frequency with those ace-x combos. So things like ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, ace-10 are going to elect to take a check call line pretty frequently, whereas other hands like 8 high are going to just bet a bit more, or maybe Jack 10 is going to check raise as a bluff, or a 7 is going to check raise or bet a bit more, but ace-x is going to check call a lot, and the hands that you want to get paid by when you have a 7 are typically hands that check call down and things like that, that are mediocre and not investing much themselves, and therefore you have to bet to get value from them. But when you block a bunch of those hands, there's less hands in your opponent's range that you need to bet against to generate value, and so you can actually rely on making a bit more from the polar extremities of his range. So that means that on the turn, if villain has pocket kings, he may overbet, he may bet really big anyway, and then proceed to overbet river, in which case you can just snap down or raise river with your 7 and win a giant pot. And if villain has a hand like Jack 9 here, Jack 8, 10 8, Well, the best way to get value from those hands usually is to actually slow play and allow them to bluff the turn. So what the ace is doing here is kind of unblocking a lot of the value bets on the turn, like overpairs, but also unblocking a lot of the air hands and blocking the hands that you actually need to rush pot growth against. That's the ace-x region. So that just makes it a little bit less urgent. It's not a massive deal breaker because clearly an ace is just one card, and villain can have all kinds of other 7x and stuff. So it's fine to bet here. It's just not mandatory anymore. Ace-jack, you might be like, why is this mediocre looking hand betting 55% of the time? Is this not in that aforementioned medium part of your range that wants to check a lot? Well, actually, no. It's not quite that far down because we're in a really wide range battle here. Small blind against big blind. Ace-jack is actually a very clear high equity hand that's good enough to value bet the flop. Not only is it good enough to value bet the flop, it's also going to have some nice implied odds because the pair draws that it has here are technically, I guess you could say, two pair draws with 2 7s on the board. The ace and the jack are just going to be really valuable in a wide range spot because they're going to be worth more than they would be against an under the gun player or in a 3-bet pot or in a spot where ranges were a lot stronger. So the wider and weaker the pre-flop ranges, the better it is to just turn a pair draw into a pair and just hit a jack on the turn and win a massive pot. You can really do that here. So very important to see ace-jack is just above middle here and therefore able to value bet. So both of these hands are going to bet about half the time. Also betting around half the time, and I wouldn't really discriminate very much between 45 and 55% frequencies. I wouldn't really see that as much of a difference. I would lump Jack 6, a kind of less backdoor straighty hand than Queen 4, I guess you could say. That's not necessarily true, actually. There's not a huge obvious difference between Jack 6 and Queen 4. There's a slight difference that Jack 6 has a slightly worse pair draw and a different straight draw. Maybe the 6x is just a bit more abundant in our range. We have other combos of 6x that we bet with. We don't have as much 4x to bet, so we bet Queen 4 more often. Could be something like that going on, but I wouldn't worry too much about the difference between Jack 6 and Queen 4 here. I would just say, well, we don't have a backdoor flush draw, so possibly it's a bit less urgent to put loads of money in the pot immediately. It's just an optional bluff now, not a mandatory one, although I suspect that Queen 4 of spades is not overly mandatory. I think if you were to check that hand, you wouldn't make a catastrophic blunder or anything of the sort. And then ace 9 off. This is a hand that's the closest to the middle of all of the hands in this little warm-up game here. The reason that this hand is not a pure check is that, well, on the flop, there's this thing that we're going to meet later, this rule, theorem in the Carrot Poker School that just tells you that on the flop, especially on a lower board, you can bet lots of hands for different reasons. We'll meet that in a minute. But the idea here is that this hand harvests value. It can get called by hands it's doing quite well against. It has some implied odds type value to it as well, because hitting top pair of 9s with an ace kicker blind versus blind after flop going bet call, remember small blind's going to check raise a lot of their overpairs here, is going to be a really strong hand for ace 9 to hit. Similarly, the pair of aces is pretty good as well, although less good, because villain's going to be check calling a lot more ace-x on the flop than overpairs, so the ace is going to be a more dominated card when it falls than the 9 is on this node where he check calls flop, but both are pretty good. And then the other thing about ace 9 is that it's a fairly vulnerable hand in the sense that all fold equity on the flop when you have just ace high is going to be useful. When your opponent folds king 5 or queen 10 or 8-6, all of these hands have live pair draw and some have backdoor straight draw to boot. So there's really not many hands in this configuration that are pure checks. There are a few of them, but they have to be the absolute middle of your range. In order to pure check a hand, for a hand to be like so mediocre that it has to check on a board like 7-7-3, you actually have to have a hand bang in the middle, and we'll see what that is in a minute. But ace 9 is above that. That's a hand that can thin value bet / denial bet and just is useful. In no sense is that a bluff. Villain isn't folding ace 10 plus here if he knows how to play poker in the spot. Some of your opponents might, you never know, right? You might get people that play a little bit weak here as well. You may be thinking, why are you teaching me these bet frequencies? How on earth am I able to remember these, and what's the point of remembering them? And the answer is that you're not meant to remember them. I'm not showing you percentages so that you write them down and be like, okay, 7-7-3, Jack 6 bets this off. And don't even write down these percentages. That's not what's important. What's important here is the pattern of polarization, the shape of range that you're crafting. And what you're doing here is crafting a range that bets weaker hands that have a little bit of nut potential, like the Queen 4 of spades, and really strong hands that unblock the calling range more often in order to satisfy that polarized blueprint that we're crafting here. Then the mediocre hands are going to be betting less often, like ace 9, and there'll be some hands that are quite good or really thick value but block calls or a bit of an anomaly, like ace 7. Then you have some hands like jack 6 that are just kind of garbagey but do bet sometimes, just not as often as the hands richer in backdoor equity. And you can see how it works, right? All hands are bet sometimes, apart from the absolute middle, which is going to be somewhere below ace-9 with less nut potential than a hand like a gut shot. So you can think about what that could be, right? We'll get to that though. But first, my favourite, pitfall time. What are some pitfalls? What are some ways that people misconstruct their betting range in the big blind when they face a small blind check, or in any other float bet situation for that matter on the flop? 773 is one of these boards where, if you're not careful, you can bet pairs all the time. It's just very tempting to bet a pair here. So we could fall into the following trap first and foremost when it comes to float betting the flop. The linearization pitfall is actually an accumulation of two different traps coming together at the same time, two different thought process fallacies biting you simultaneously. The first fallacy here is the idea that you need to have some kind of caliber of hand to bluff the flop. This is a fairly good board for big blind, and in position on a fairly good board for your range, you're able to bet quite freely and bluff without too many standards in spots such as this. So when you have a hand here like Jack 4, it's very tempting when you first start out to just write your hand off and say, this is a terrible hand. In fact, if you watch live poker players playing in softer games, there's quite often some live, softer televised games, and not everyone on there is a particularly academically schooled poker player. They tend to not have watched all of the Carrot Poker School. They should have. A lot of the time they don't. I don't know why. But what you'll see them do is play a sort of friendly check down pot quite often, which is one of the most theoretically unsound and horrible things you can actually do strategically. But small blind will open a hand like 9-10. Big blind will call a hand like 8-6. And neither one will have a backdoor draw or even a straight draw or something. And as soon as one of them hits a draw or a pair, they're just like, I bet I have hand now. The other guy folds. It's like, okay, nice hand. Yeah, well done. Tap the table. A lot of the time, though, no one picks up any draw or pair because the run out's just completely dry. And they just check all the way down. They're just like, yep, check, friendly pot, check down, check down. I don't know if it's etiquette, it's just lack of knowledge. I don't know what's going on. Maybe both. It's silly. Basically, the person with the range advantage here should be bluffing at some point. Depending, who that will depend on the run out. But if you have a range advantage and the bottom of your range is currently your 2 hole cards, you need to bluff that hand. So one thing you should do immediately on the flop here as big blind is just start bluffing a bunch of your trash. Not always. We're not saying like bet like a monkey. Always bet no matter what when check to. Although actually against humans with underprotected betting ranges, that checking ranges, against humans with underprotected checking ranges, that actually works really well. But the thing is, we don't want to do it all the time, but you should do it sometimes. Otherwise, what happens is that you just start bluffing from the top down and only bluff with certain draws, and you have hardly any good draws on this texture with which to bluff with. So you have to bluff backdoors, pair draws. Remember, pair draws are a type of draw too, and you're never dead here. In 773, another reason why you don't have to be super selective with what you bluff is that even Jack 4 has pair outs as 6 outs immediately against Ace King or some hand that may check call like that in small blind's range. The other problem with the linearization pitfall is that people bet too often with their value hands. So they're like, pocket sixes, let's bet we need protection, let's bet we need value. And that's probably true against a very passive opponent that's never really check raising you and has a super weak range. Maybe now your hand is like 80% equity and it's been upgraded so much against that player that checks a totally underprotected range that now you need to value bet urgently. But in GTO, sixes is optional because the small blind is meant to be playing what we call a mixed polarized strategy, which means they should be slow playing a lot of their good hands. So while their betting range is polar, their good hands still mix check, as do some of their bluffs, and you get check raised here by both bluffs and value hands and things like that. And the existence of that branch, in theory, is what makes sixes an optional check back here. You might be correct in betting it every single time against someone who's not bluffing later, someone who's just playing the I mindlessly check down game against you with air. You should bet sixes against them. Why not take that free denial of equity when you're not inducing any bluffs by checking? But in general, in theory, against strong opposition, you'll get eaten alive by succumbing to the linearization pitfall. So it's incredibly important to be aware of this one and be able to avoid it. You can catch yourself in the act of doing this and actually straighten your thought process out. But I do want to stress it might be okay to do this against certain people. At least the always betting sixes type of move might be okay, but I certainly don't think it's okay against anyone to only bluff really high equity hands like straight draws. So draw mania is the habit of always betting a draw. Always betting every draw. And there are people who play like this. You may well play like this. Don't be ashamed of it. It's okay if you do. Why do you do this? Because it just seems good, right? You get to bluff. You get to win the pot now. And if you don't, you have a draw, a win-win. You can craft an argument for betting here very easily. But the thing is that poker is a game of comparisons. So when you have the choice between betting and checking, it's not enough to just list option A. You have to know how much money is in box B as well, right? In order to compare it to box A. So the EV of checking here is also very good. And the reason it's great is that in GTO, you're being trapped sometimes. You're being check raised, you're being bluff raised, you're being attacked. And by checking, you get full realization of equity without having to pay any more money. That's a bonus. Secondly, you may turn a 6 or a 4, and you actually like villain's range to be wide and unfiltered when that happens a lot of the time. Thirdly, you can still bluff turns when checked to again. You can call turn and then bluff river when checked to. You have other ways of realizing your fold equity here. And in theory, your fold equity shouldn't be like ridiculous here anyway. It shouldn't be much more than your break-even point, if more at all. But in practice, I do appreciate that some opponents are folding 50% of their range to a 1/3 pot size bet here. And against those guys, it probably is correct to just always bet 6-4. I just want you guys to know that it's theoretically unsound. What happens if you always bet this hand in theory is that when you check back, you never have a draw in your range, and that's just silly. There's no reason to play like that, theoretically speaking. It's very exploitable, and I'd urge you guys to look out for draw mania in your opponent's games as well. So if you do check here as small blind and big blind checks back, let's reverse the positions hypothetically here, and the turn is a 4 or a 5 or some straight completing card, it's very unlikely that an unskilled and relatively aggressive opponent actually has a straight ever. So it's just something to bear in mind, and it's something that, you know, you're not meant to always have the nuts in every spot. It's okay to be capped sometimes, but out of position on the flop as a small blind with ample opportunity to check raise and get value that way, there's no reason why you have to be capped when you check the flop. But a lot of your opponents will be. Look out for it. Protection obsession is just such an absolutely rampant epidemic. This is something that actually bothered me for a while in a way that just really irked me. It really annoyed me. And I wanted to like fix it in all of my students' games. But now I've just accepted that it's everywhere. It's like this disease. It's like a sort of vermin of the poker world, this protection obsession. People are so drawn to like make a vlog and be like, I bet for protection. I bet because we need protection here. Our hand benefits from protection. They're just so quick to say these things about protection and just bet automatically and use this as a sole justification that it's really hard to actually teach people not to do it. It's just everywhere. Influences absolutely every poker student because they see content left, right, and center where people do this. It's not that protection is completely unhelpful or that there isn't a benefit to it, and indeed if I thought the small blind player was A, not bluffing much later after they checked flop, and B, just overfolding and folding lots of stuff and never really raising me, I would absolutely bet king 3 every single time. So there's a time and a place to always bet king 3. I just want you guys to know that in spots where your opponent's range are properly protected, such as they just checked you as the big blind, or maybe they checked you here and they're a stronger player with a protected range, protection is outweighed by all the times you get aggressed upon, by the times you get raised, by the times you bet and run into stronger stuff, basically. Protection doesn't come for free, and it only gets you a little bit of the pot because you already own most of the pot when you make your opponent fold an inferior hand here. He folds maybe 2 overcards max, and you make him fold 20-something% equity. You still had 70-something% of the pot before making that bet. So these are all things that can cause you to just naturally, as a human, play a bad strategy in this spot. Look out for your opponents committing all 3 of these fallacies and look to punish them for it, while at the same time remembering that it's okay for you to play this way if you're doing it exploitatively, but it's not okay for these things to be your baseline game against a strong opponent. SRPs are single raise pots. Let's talk about nut advantage and range advantage typically in these situations. So when the preflop raiser checks out of position, he or she tends to maintain some range advantage, in theory. And this is because when you check, you're not meant to just suddenly cripple your range and reduce it to being this capped wreck of a range that can only defend 30% of the time to a small bet. That's how people play sometimes, but it's not correct. So in theory, range advantage actually stays, or at least isn't ruined massively by a flop check out of position, but nut advantage might take a little bit more of a hit. That said, because out of position you can still check raise, and any time that you can check raise, you're usually off the hook when it comes to value betting. Like, you may not have to value bet all of the hands that you would have to in position, but you can't check raise. Well, what happens now is that some of your nut prevalence goes away, but you're still slow playing your good stuff sometimes. So the way you should think about nut advantage in the small blind's case here is that they forfeit some of it, but they probably still have a good amount of nut advantage on some textures. So what this means is that when we're on different boards, we need to think about to what extent the range advantage and nut advantage reside with each player. It's always important to ask this because it helps you determine your frequency and sizing. Your range advantage determines how often your range would like to bet in theory, and the nut advantage determines how big your range would like to go because it sets the average investment ceiling for your value bets, and your value bets chase that as soon as they need to, or sometimes they take their foot off the gas and just wait around because the investment ceiling's on average not that big for those hands. So back to this flop then. How big do you think these things are here? Range advantage and nut advantage for big blind after small blind checks. On low pair textures, big blind is going to pick up a nut advantage because the 7x is going to be a bit more dense in big blind's range than it will be in the range of the small blind player. The reason for this is that while small blind does have some 7x, king 7 suited, ace 7 suited, 7 8 suited, 9 7 6 7 7 5 suited, etc., a7 off, king 7 off, the list goes on, these hands are going to be heavily diluted by what is combinatorially speaking a really big range, right? It's got hundreds and hundreds of combinations, 700, something like that in some cases. 700 would be a little bit wide pre-flop, but 600 comfortably. These hands do exist, but they're diluted by lots of really big cards. Small blind is renowned for opening hands at full frequency, like king 8 offsuit, ace, everything offsuit basically, down to about ace 3 or ace deuce, I guess. But you're opening so many big offsuit cards that are combinatorically speaking very abundant, that the 7x in your range when you're small blind is very diluted. Big blind actually has 7x overall kind of frequently as well. Also has some offsuit 7s and does flat some hands like 6-7 off and 8-7 off actually in this configuration. Moreover, big blind is going to be drowning in suited 7s, and these 7s in the big blind's range are furthermore going to be more concentrated because big blind's range is not so cluttered with big clumsy offsuit cards that miss this flop, thus increasing big blind's nut prevalence as a percentage of his or her range compared to that of the small blind player. So when we look at the overall range explorer graph here in PIO2, we see that the red player, the in position line here, is behind for the most part, but when it gets to the very top, the 7x region, the big blind's range suddenly spikes ahead by having a wider horizontal spread of hands there. Dots are hands in this figure. The fact that at the far right of the figure, the red range is wider than the green one signifies that more 7x combos exist in that range. Pocket 3s exist at the very top in both ranges. We'll ignore that for now. The 7x is where the abundant nuts reside here. This is not a huge range advantage in the same sense that when you have all the overpairs on deuce, deuce, deuce and your opponent doesn't, that you're absolutely killing them. It's not quite that big, but it's big enough to warrant a large bet from big blind. Basically, enough of big blind's value range are 7s that are crushing overpairs that it's in big blind's interest to use a big bet on this texture. So our recommendation here is going to be to bet semi-frequently, not like loads, but we're doing okay range-wise here as well. This is not a bad range at all for big blind's range. Remember, nut advantage is one part of range advantage, but then we're going to use a big sizing when we do bet. So semi-frequent betting with a big sizing, that's what we expect here, because although our range is not doing great, it's surviving. It's not a big range disadvantage here. Our nutted region is, and it's more concentrated than our opponent's one. The reason that the answer to our initial quiz there just basically led to a ton of betting from numerous different hand classes was really to do with how messy the flop is equity-wise. The river is a very clean and orderly street in that when your opponent bets the river, they will have bluffs and value bets, nothing in between. You will have a bluff catcher, which is usually in between their bluffs and value. You might have a different hand, in which case it's easier to just raise, call, or fold. But you will often have a bluff catcher and you'll have to work out, are they over bluffing, are they under bluffing, what the combo's like, what the blocker's like, what's my equity, what's my required equity, and then the spot's solved. That's really all you've got to do. I made that sound probably more simple than it is, but that's all you've got to do. On the flop though, you can typically get away with a bit more betting, especially on lower boards, because there's a lot of time left in the hand and equities are very far from what their final resting place will be by the river. But these so-called young equities, if we may expand upon this life sort of metaphor for a second, young equities are ones that have not reached their full potential yet. They may go up, they may go down, they may end up just winning always, they may end up just being mediocre by the end against villain's range. It really depends on the run out. But on the flop, because there is so much time left in the hand, equities are just going to be closer together, like they would be in a game like PLO, where you have more cards. Pre-flop, of course, equities are as close as they ever will be in Hold'em. You can open a hand like Jack 9, get called by Ace 3, and it's a kind of 58-42% shootout. So that's very, very close, right? When hands run that close, it means that range equities will typically also run quite close, and the closer you get to the river, the further away a hand's equity will be from your opponent's hand's equity, on average. So young equities are in need of, I don't want to say in need of, but young equities benefit a bit more from fold equity because your opponent's usually got a more sizable chunk that they're relinquishing when they fold to your bet. So equities run even closer together on the flop than they do on the turn. They're a bit more close together on the turn than they are on the river, but even more so on the flop because the player who's behind almost always has significant redraw against the non-nutted region, at least of the equity leader's range. So mixed bag rule is basically the idea that there are all kinds of different hands that can bet here, and those kinds of hands can all bet for lots of different reasons. They can bet for value, they can bet as a bluff, and they can bet to deny equity as well, and most often as a combination of 2 or 3 of these reasons. For example, when we bet with a hand like King 5 of diamonds, you might be like, well, that's a kind of mediocre, hopeless looking hand. Why is that betting? Well, as we saw, we don't want to fall into the clutches of the linearization pitfall and just look for a hand with 2 spades every single time when we're betting here, or 2 hearts or clubs. We can bet some non-backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draws as well, especially with a very good pair draw and an okay pair draw. Any pair draw is like fairly good, blind versus blind, because usually people just don't have a pair. So even turning a 5 here, having bet the flop and being called by small blind is going to give you a sizable chunk of equity, because so much of small blind's range will be ace high or king high. We can get called by worse hands immediately. We can see that a big queen, such as queen jack, which actually has a lot of showdown value, doesn't raise us off of our bluff on the flop. It actually just merely calls, and we're doing well against that hand. We can show down under some circumstances and win, and we may end up actually hitting the river and catching bluffs from hands like this sometimes too. We can also fold out better hands. Now, of course, villain can't have this exact king 9 here because we have the king of diamonds, as was pointed out to me by a student last time I taught this one live. But the thing is, it doesn't matter. The king 9 is just illustrating that some better hands fold. This could be king 9 of clubs or king of clubs 9 of diamonds or whatever, right? There are king 9 combos and other better hands in villain's range that are not strong enough to call this bet with. We also get some denial. I don't want to say we need protection, because it just forces us to feel like we're up against it, like we have to bet, like our back's to the wall. That's not the case at all. You can slow play hands like this, and a bit lofty to call it slow playing, but you can check hands like this and delay your bluffing. Sometimes the board just becomes even drier. It just dries out on the turn and a 3 comes, and then your king X is just showdown value and you check. Or what can happen is the board can wetten, like a queen can come down or a jack or something, and then you turn your king high into a bluff later, possibly as well. But the idea is that this is a very young equity. It's going to improve often, or it's going to fold out hands that your opponent could improve with often, and you can get called by worse and fold out better simultaneously. So mixed bag rule really does apply here. There's a mixed bag of hands betting for a mixed bag of reasons. Mixed bag rule will apply on any flop, whether it's a c-bet node or a float bet opportunity node. Like I said at the start, this lecture is very applicable to other spots in the game tree too, but it will apply on any flop that's low for sure, and it will apply to a slightly lesser extent on bigger flops, as we'll see. But any low board in position, blind versus blind, you're going to do a lot of mixed bag betting. What is the role of denial then in float betting? Because while it's not something that forces you to bet, how much denial you're getting does influence the overall look of your strategy. So on low neutral flops, that means flops that are not massively and clearly better for either player and are also simultaneously just lower, all equity bands of hand can bet as a float bet. Usually, apart from maybe the absolute middle. Sometimes it's something I like to call the absolute median of your range, and these hands are just going to have to check, but there isn't a wide band of hands that has to check for mediocrity when it comes to betting a low flop, because there's just so much denial up for grabs that it pushes thinner value bets towards being okay, and flimsy frail bluffs are okay as well. They get some protection too. Even if they have a bit of showdown value, they get fold equity from better hands and worse hands. So here, when we have a hand like this isn't just value, it's value denial. If it was only value, like if your opponent's folding range was always drawing dead to ace 10, you would never bet ace 10. So here protection has swung you from not wanting to bet to wanting to bet, but it hasn't done that on its own. It was still very important that you can get called by a lot of worse hands and your hand has a lot of equity. So ace 10 here is basically a value bet because you'll be surviving in equity terms when check called. You won't be doing great, but you'll be surviving and you get some useful fold equity from tons and tons of countless hands like queen 9 and jack 8, etc. Bluff denial is also a thing you can also combine in float bet spots and c-bet spots on the flop. Bluffing with denial because queen 6 is getting both better and worse hands to fold. Hopefully that makes sense. It's actually got a bit more equity than you would think as well. It comes in at 35.84% equity, which is quite a lot for just queen high. And again, it just goes to show you just how good hands are compared to what they look like in really wide range configurations like this one. But contrast this to a higher flop, where equities actually run further apart. Well, why do they run further apart on a higher flop? This is because you're either very far ahead or behind your opponent's range a ton of the time. So for example, on a monotone flop, you are dead to flushes and unpaired hands are just never catching up against flushes, that sort of thing. However, on a board like this, the hands that are ahead are not as far ahead, and then on a board that's like ace high or king high or relevantly paired, maybe something like king king 3 or king queen 4 or something like that, these boards are also going to be situations where equities run further apart, where there's less denial to get, and the hands that are winning are way ahead and the hands that are losing are way behind. So the more of a sort of way ahead, way behind, people like to say this, situation the texture provides, the less small betting for denial there will be, the less wide you'll bet for value, the less you'll combine bluffing with protection to bet for two reasons at the same time, and the more it will just be a case of betting your really good hands and your bluffs. That's the important point. So on higher flops, we'll simply adopt a strategy of infrequent big bets, because the idea is that we will have some nutty hands, we'll have some nut advantage perhaps after small blind checks and causes some of them to leave his range, or at least equalize the nut advantage a bit. Maybe we won't gain it every single time, but we'll catch up a bit. But we won't have a range advantage on a board like Ace King 4 if we get checked to here, or King Jack 4 or something. As big blind, we're not going to be interested in reopening action at high frequency, because our fold equity is not as high as on 773, and there isn't really as much denial to get, and your opponent's range is just going to contain way more hands that absolutely smoke you. So you're going to be doing a lot more selective betting on a board like King Jack 4, where you're way more polarized, you're only really betting strong value hands and bluffs, and you're letting those strong value hands drive the bus of your range, so to speak, and decide on the direction of your sizing. So here, for example, it just doesn't make sense to want to bet a hand like Queen 5 because your range is not doing as well now. The equities are running further apart as well, so you're less likely to get useful fold equity than you are on 773, where villain's always folding overcards to your pair. When you bet with a queen, you're just making undercards fold. Yes, he might have a gut shot, but that probably doesn't just check fold the flop. So the fold equity usually comes from two low cards that are drawing fairly dead or drawing to back doors, runners against your Queen X. So betting a hand like this does constitute a small mistake in GTO. I would just adopt a big bet here like the solver does, and therefore I would not be betting a hand with 62.7% equity. You'll note that the solver does suggest EV-wise that you could possibly bet third pot here. It seems to have the same EV as checking, but I wouldn't do that. The solver doesn't do that, but it doesn't have the same reasoning for me as not doing that. The reason the solver doesn't do this is that there just wasn't enough reason to build a betting range. There were no hands in this range that had to bet one third pot, but there were loads of hands that had to check. So the solver just built its strategy around big betting. Some hands really preferred that to small betting and checking. However, my reason for not doing this is a lot more human, and it's just that it's counterintuitive, it's awkward, and it kind of goes against everything that we've been learning to build a small bet on this board, because you want to let your value hands do the betting, and if Queen X doesn't have to bet for value here ever, then why build it? Just build a big bet for something like Ace X, two pair sets, let those really good hands that need to bet drive the sizing. Queen X doesn't need to bet. It doesn't gain anything from it. Sixes gains a lot more on 7-3 deuce or 10-6-4. So it's a set there, let's say 8-7-3 or something like that. Like even a pair of sixes on 8-7-3 is going to gain a lot more than something like this hand will here, like King 8. Well, King 8's kind of a bit too far up, but even something like pocket 5s or pocket 7s on Ace Queen 6 is not going to gain anywhere near as much in the way of useful fold equity than a low pair on some low board would. So on low boards, we want to bet more often because there's more denial at stake and there's a bit more reason to stretch our value range out. Equities are a lot younger. The flop is more dynamic in the sense that when we get villain to fold, they're folding more equity. People just have more equity against each other, and it's more useful to get fold equity. On bigger boards, the flop is already older in a sense because the impactful cards have already landed and predefined who's doing well and who's not, and therefore Ace Queen 6 is not fully a way ahead, way behind spot, but it's much more of one than 7-7-3, and so betting thinly for value doesn't come with the same bonus of denial as it does in the flop at the top there, and therefore we can just revert to betting a more polarized range for a bigger sizing and just let the big value hands bet and check the more frail ones, the more mediocre ones. On to semi-polarized strategies in general now. How do we concoct them? Well, first off, we want to play a semi-polarized strategy on boards that are doing okay for us, boards where our range is not like a big underdog or something, and where we do benefit from betting more depolarized and betting hands that are only thin for value, because denial is also a prominent thing. So on 7-7-3 Rainbow, blind versus blind, we adopt the strategy of betting big. This is because we do have a lot of 7x driving our value range, but we also bet quite frequently because we gain a bit more from denial. So you'll see some counterintuitive looking hands like Ace Jack, Ace 10, Ace 9 betting here. They're getting called by worse, they're getting useful fold equity. You'll also see some hands like deuces and fours, just thick value betting for this sizing, and the reason that they want to do that sometimes for a big bet is that the fold equity they get is actually very useful. Your opponent's never going to be dead against you when you've got two fours here. He'd have to have two cards below a 4, and that's impossible. Only one card can be below a 4, and it's the most rare card in the whole deck. in terms of what people choose to play pre-flop. So here you can see that we are betting only semi-polarized, and the reason for this is that we are checking mainly medium strength hands, but also like some good hands sometimes. But what really makes this semi-polarized is that we're choosing to bet some quite thin hands for value as well as some thick ones. So this is a semi-polarized strategy because we're in a decent spot for range and the board is low, giving us useful fold equity, and it's a big bet because we have a 7x monopoly here compared to our opponent. He does have some 7x, but they're a lot less concentrated in his range than they are in our range. So that's why we have frequency and sizing being picked in that way. And you can see this gels well with lecture 6, I believe, on range advantage and nut advantage. So some focus questions for you just to get your head around this a bit better. Why is King Jack a cannot bet hand here? There are not many of them. Why is King Jack one of them? Question 2, why is A7 only an optional value bet instead of a full value bet? I think I've answered this, but can you put it into a succinct explanation? Can you write something down? And question 3, how are you going to improve your strategy, theoretically speaking, now that you've seen this lesson on this texture, blind versus blind? How will you play a low board like this better in future? What things will you change about your game? I'll give you a few seconds and I'll give you some answers. I'll assume you've done that. So King Jack is a cannot bet hand because it's the epitome of a mediocre hand in your range. It's the absolute middle. The showdown value that this hand has is just a bit too bad to start value betting and a bit too good to start bluffing. You don't need a particularly bad hand to bluff here, nor do you need a particularly good hand to value bet because the fold equity is so useful and the denial is good. You still don't want to have the absolute middle. There will still be some hands that constitute an EV mistake to bet because they are just that mediocre. Secondly here, why is A7 only optional? Well, the other 7s are pretty mandatory, so the idea with A7 is that you're just blocking calls and unblocking bluffs, so it's to do with the removal effect. You're less likely to run into ace high when you have this card as your kicker, and therefore there are less hands that invest passively against you, and more hands that will just bet turn or bluff you later anyway, like jack high or pocket kings or something like that in villain's range. How will you improve your strategy? This is a bit more personal, it's up to you. The main ones I think that students would answer here would be avoiding the linearization pitfall, finding some weaker bluffs, understanding that you don't always want to bet a draw, understanding that you don't need protection, just having a bit more balance to your strategy basically, and being less of a sitting duck for the more experienced regs who are actually awaiting people to just play way too cap to check back range here and way too draw heavy and value heavy a betting range. Just very common at low stakes that's how people play. So the better regs will be waiting for it. That's how they make their money. So fully polarized strategies on higher flops. Let's just flesh these out a little bit more. So the strategy we play on the higher flop of ace queen x is going to be fully polar. The betting frequency is going to be lower on a board like ace queen x because the texture is less favorable for us and there's less denial to gain by betting. So one, we just don't like that board as much. We can't value bet as many hands there, therefore we don't get to bluff as much because we need to be balanced to some extent. And secondly, the denial that we get when our opponent folds is not as beneficial because there's not as many overcards to our pairs that are folding. 2 reasons to bet less often. Note here that the nut advantage is also a little smaller, so the solver is a little torn between sizes. Okay, we don't have the 7x being a massive monopoly of the nuts in our range anymore on ace queen 5, but still the solver does like betting big on a board like ace queen 5, so I think we can simplify the strategy to only using this big bet on this node. It wouldn't really be purposeful at all to build a small bet into our strategy here. Using B33 is something that makes our life hard without really providing any kind of gain. So let's avoid that. Some focus questions then for how to build a big bet strategy on this board. Firstly, why do you think deuces is optional but eights is cannot bet? Secondly, write some stuff down for these. Why is ace 4 a pure check? Couldn't it bet for value, don't you think? And thirdly, explain why jack 8 of clubs is a cannot bluff hand here. We didn't see this on the 7-7x, lots of hands were betting, so why does jack 8 of clubs always check here? Because it does. The only jack 8 that's betting here is hearts. Maybe a trace of diamonds, but I think just hearts. Question 1, the answer is that deuces just gains way more fold equity that's useful. It may even make villain fold a stronger hand occasionally, like 4s or 5s or 3s. I doubt villain will be folding like 8s or 9s or 10s here, but certainly some of these lower pairs can be folding. And also 8s is going to just have a lot more stable showdown value. Deuces will benefit more from denial because whenever villain folds, he'll fold 2 overcards to deuces, but with 8s it may often be 1 or 0 overcards that are being folded, so the fold equity for the latter hand doesn't have as much utility. Ace 4 is a pure check because it doesn't have to bet. Is it strong enough to big bet here? It's borderline. If you were building a small bet here, it could probably do that. Could it also big bet? I would think so, but it really doesn't have to. And because your range is doing badly here, what you don't want to do is just leave the checks to out there to die alone. Basically, you need to protect them with some good hands so that your opponent can't just like adopt some policy of always betting the turn and reaping way more fold equity than he should be entitled to theoretically. So the idea here is that our range doesn't crave a high investment frequency because it just contains way more bad hands than our opponent's range does and less good hands. Therefore, it has to check often, and the average hand that's just on the cusp of being able to value bet will just opt not to, because the checking range needs its presence a lot more than the betting range wants its presence. So that's why we check ace-4 pure there, even though the hand is verging on something that's good enough to value bet equity-wise, I would think. You can see that ace-7 is the first hand in the solver strategy, and this may only be ace-7 with a backdoor flush draw, is the only hand that actually is strong enough to bother mixing any bet in here. And then when you get up to like ace-10, ace-jack, obviously you have a very powerful hand and now you're betting at higher frequency. The only pure bet here really is going to be, I think, pocket sixes or ace-6 perhaps. Ace-queen is not a hand you get here with pre. Why can jack-8 of clubs never bluff? The idea is that in less favourable worlds, as we saw at the end of the previous lecture, you're going to need to have a higher caliber of bluff because this world is just inherently unfavourable for the big blind player, even after the small blinds check, at least in theory, maybe not in practice. We've talked about that, right? How humans are too capped here, but solvers really do protect their checking ranges here as small blind, thus preserving the equity of their range and landing the big blind in a really unfavourable world where they just have to be more selective about what they bluff. Here's a good order for your thought process to adopt. Pick your strategy first and then think about how your hand fits into it. In other words, design a blueprint or protocol and then think about slotting your hand into that blueprint. So the key to the most orderly and logical thought processes in poker, in this spot and in many others, is usually to remind yourself roughly how your range will play, how will it divide itself, and then ask how your hand fits into this master plan. Let's practice this exercise with 3 examples. So firstly, how do you think about how to play 8-6 on this flop? Because if you don't have a blueprint and you don't use the orderly thought process that we've actually just been tacitly instructing you to use today, which is to plan the shape of the range and the sizing and then slot the hand in, you might just end up randomly betting or checking here based on a whimsical or incomplete reason, such as I want protection, or I don't think he has an ace now, or maybe something like I have a mediocre hand, I don't want to bloat the pot. If you use any of these reasons, you just use an incomplete thought process, basically. So how do you get better at this? Well, let's start by asking, how big do we want to bet when we're betting? And how often do we want to bet? Let's clear those 2 things up. We don't want to bet often as big blind on ace-queen 6 because the small blind's range is strong in theory and stronger than ours, so we're going to bet sparingly. We're going to bet therefore really polarized. We don't need a lot of denial either. We don't benefit much from it. So we're mostly going to be checking our mediocre hands. This hand is the epitome of mediocre. I could maybe find a case for betting like 6-4 of diamonds here or something. 8-6 of spades I would just check every time. So fully polarized strategy. The hand will not bet in this model. Big bet if I do bet, but not betting this hand. The way I think about that is you're taking a gun to a level in a computer game. Which gun do you bring with you? That doesn't mean that you're firing that gun all the time as soon as you choose it. I choose the shotgun for this level. I will fire it when a baddie comes. I won't just like go into the level just blasting away because that's my gun. So the idea is that just because you're choosing a big bet for this spot doesn't mean you're choosing it with every hand in your range, and this hand will not use the gun that you've brought to this level. It will just check. If it had bet, it would have used a big bet because that's your weapon of choice, but you're not betting this hand, given that that's your weapon of choice. Even if you were using small bets, I wouldn't bother betting this hand anyway, but that's another story. Okay, 7-7-3 with Jack 8. Have a go at this first, yourself. Okay, I'll assume you've done that. If you've been listening today, if you've been avidly taking notes throughout this lecture and almost pretending like you're sat in the classroom doing this, then you will have no problem in knowing that this hand is fine to bet. You're in a more favourable world now. The strategy is only semi-polarised. There are a lot more hands that have higher utility in betting on a low board because the fold equity that you are garnering is much more useful for your EV, and therefore this hand can definitely, being a relatively polarised hand with some backdoors, can definitely bluff a lot. It could also check and bluff a bit later or see what happens, but it's fine to bet immediately with Jack 8. Blind versus blind ace queen 6, back to this board. Well, we know the strategy is a fully polarised one. What would you do with this hand? I'll give you a few seconds to pause and unpause. I'll assume you've had a go at this. Well, with ace jack, you are comfortably in the value region, so you can bet. Do you have to bet? Was your answer I would bet? If so, congratulations, not, because you've just fallen victim to the linearization pitfall. It's got you. It's made you bet a hand always that you should only be betting sometimes, and you've left your poor checking range even more underprotected than it already is in theory. So, sitting duck there for exploitation if you always bet ace-jack. Ace-jack is not so good against villains' range that you just have to bet. It's not sixes, it's not ace-6, it's not queen-6, you don't have to bet with it. 3-bet pots. Let's finish up today's class with a word on these. 3-bet pots are a bit different, not because the framework changes. We still want to bet more often in spots where we get useful fold equity, so lower boards. We still want to bet a bit more often as a pre-flop caller here, the guy that's called the 3-bet, in situations where we have a more of a range advantage and less of a disadvantage. And we still want to size up when we have a nut advantage and size down when we don't. That's the way it's going to go. But the textures on which these things are true and false are going to differ a little bit, because the ranges pre-flop differ. So let's say we call a 3-bet on the button against a small blind. This is the most common 3-bet pot in the whole game tree. And small blind checks to us. What is the overall range versus range picture like now after small blinds check on the flop? Have a think about it. How would you class our range advantage and nut advantage here as button, and what kind of strategy would you apply? Here's what I think. On the one hand, our range is denser in pocket pairs and less dense in unpaired holdings. We don't have as many king-jack offsuit, diluting our range because we would of course have folded that or 4-bet it before the flop. Meanwhile, small blind has a lot of these cards. So we will naturally wield some sort of small to modest range advantage here. Maybe it'll be 50-50 depending on the inputs you use. The higher the rake structure you actually use here, the worse button's range will be, because button will just call way more like lower unpaired cards. That's not terrible for 855, but in general, button's range is weaker at higher rake structures when you look at sims because they're just calling a lot more liberally. At lower rake structures, they're being more selective and they tend to have way more pocket pair heavier range, which is very good for a board like 855. I want to stress that pocket pairs are very strong here equity-wise, even though they're not technically the nuts. Something like 9s is really good. It's not nutted, but it's a strong hand that drives up the equity of your range. Button will bet quite often and quite merged here. You'll have a small range advantage and will benefit quite a bit from denial because this flop is low and is going to allow the pocket pairs to just maintain a good amount of equity and not get counterfeited by high cards. So as we have a large nut disadvantage, because small blind, remember, is not a complete beginner, he's not falling prey to the linearization pitfall and betting all of his overpairs. Small blind is being tricky and trappy here. Sometimes he's being a snake in the grass, as small blind often is in poker, and will be doing things like check raising over pairs and check raise bluffing us with the queen, jack of diamonds, and all kinds of nasty things like that in game theory. Therefore, we have a large nut disadvantage. We're getting raised a lot anyway, so why would I need to bet big here when I have a 5? If I'm fortunate enough to be blessed with ace-5 of spades in this spot, I can just bet small. The SPR is not that big and I'll get check raised so much anyway. I really don't need to rush any pot growth. On the one hand, my investment ceiling is low, and on the other hand, I don't even need to be the one that's meeting it because villain's going to raise so often with a more polarized range than ours. More about that theorem about relative polarization in grade 2 of the school. So our sizing is small, our frequency is fairly often. That's our blueprint, our protocol. You can see here that the range explorer very much backs this up. The red range, i.e. the in-position range, is leading in equity for the most part, but when it comes to the overpair region, which is around the point in the graph about here where the out-of-position range spikes, by having more overpairs, this is where we start to suffer if we bet too big. Yes, we do have more combos of the absolute nuts, so we have a bit more 8s as a percentage of our range, or maybe something like 5x as a percentage of our range, but the thing is, it's not really by much. And we shouldn't care about that anyway because it's too few combos. So what really matters is this dense cluster of overpairs. There's just way more green dots here than there are red dots or green dots up here. So this is the part of ranges that really matter, is the sort of 80 to 85% equity hands here that come around quite often. These are more relevant to nut advantage than the few combos of 5-4 are because they're so rare. So basically the solver says the urgency is very low here to build a big pot. We can just bet small, he'll raise a lot anyway. We don't need to worry about it. Our opponent has a more polar range than ours with more combos of overpairs, so we'll bet small, but we'll bet quite often because our range is doing well. We'll benefit a lot from denial, we'll want to value bet thinly, we'll have a lot of bluffs. Let's be quite liberal. So many of our bets here, remember, are betting due to mixed bag rule for lots of different reasons, and when villain has a load of high cards, denial is once again of significant importance. Then denial becomes more of a thing, sometimes in 3-bet pots, because so many of villain's cards here in his range have 2 overcards here to our pair of 9s much more often than would happen in a single raise pot. In a single raise pot, You'd bet nines a lot in a spot like this, blind versus blind, if you were timid enough not to 3-bet it pre-flop, but it would be for a different reason. It would be based on brute strength more than such a high percentage of villain's range having 2 overcards against your hand. So sevens here is, needless to say, a medium strength hand, and it's one with 64% equity that we're very happy to bet. We don't need a really nutty hand to invest a small bet here. We don't have to bet sevens again. How often do your opponents check sevens here in real life? Probably not often enough, because they're like, I have sevens, you probably have ace king, I don't want an ace or a king coming, I bet you fold, happy days. It's a bit caveman, right? It's kind of ignoring the fact that in GTO you're meant to get check raised a ton here. If you know your opponent is actually just checking really underprotected, then again, you would just want to bet with sevens usually. You wouldn't want to allow a card to roll off because there wouldn't be a downside to betting, and if you can take protection with no downside, if you have a reward without a risk, you can bet with impunity. It's just that in GTO you can't do that because there are repercussions. And in turn, I hope this is showing you how important it is to protect your checking range so that people can't just bet with impunity against you here if you're actually the small blind player. Ace Queen is a hand that looks really mediocre. It looks like a check behind a lot, right? It's not a pair, but Ace Queen and sevens are not too far apart here. The only hand that really beats Ace Queen that doesn't beat sevens is Ace King, or the Ace Queen that chops with Ace Queen. But for the most part, if a hand is losing to sevens, it's usually also losing to Ace Queen. So Ace Queen is somewhere in the sort of value to denial neck of the woods. It's possible that you bet here and villain folds other Ace Queen combos, and with that comes some territory of bluffing as well, but mixed bag for sure. And finally, fully polarized float bet strategy in 3-bet pots. So if the board is unfavorable for the button caller, then that player will again be not so much incentivized to reopen action, more strict about what combos they're going to value bet and bluff, and just have higher standards in general, given that denial is not such a thing. In these situations, we want to save our betting mainly for our clear value bets and our bluffs. So in this situation, for example, small blind versus button, queen jack 6 two-tone, we're in a 3-bet pot. Note how little we would gain now by betting some mediocre hands like 9s or 10s. It's just really nothing. We don't get much useful fold equity. If you want to put villain on exactly ace king, good for you. He has 2 overcards and a straight draw. Guess what though? He doesn't fold, and guess what? His EV is actually probably higher than yours due to the times he bluffs you, or just gets there and wins. So there's no reason at all to even fathom betting with 9s or 10s here. It's a ridiculous bet, frankly, and it should never be made. Based on that, there's no reason, therefore, not to just bet big when you choose to bet. Making ace-4 of hearts fold would not be a particularly great pursuit. I mean, it's okay, fine. He doesn't get to occasionally hit an ace on you, but there's not a lot of stuff to gloat about in that fold equity. So we build a very high equity value range. We basically ask our value combos, guys, what do you want to do? And the hands that actually have to bet here because they have enough of a reason to are things like ace-queen, king-queen, queen-10, plus sets, 2-pair. And these hands are just screaming, yeah, bet big. Villain has quite a lot of gut shots here, quite a lot of mediocre hands that are actually going to do better against small bets than big bets when we hold a hand like ace-queen. Like when I have ace-queen and you have king-10, my EV is higher when I bet big than when I bet small. I can't like craft everything around some illusion that you always have an open-end straight draw on every flop, but just as a thought experiment, that's one reason why we want to bet bigger here with our value hands, is that villain's range is kind of mergy in the draw department. He does have quite a lot of outs here when he's behind. It's not that much of a way ahead, way behind spot as far as high boards go, but it's still enough of one that we just want to value bet our really good hands. We're not in a good enough world here to just seek denial every time we've got a jack and just bet jack 10 because he checked. Like, it's not good poker. We don't want to do that. So we bet big. We get rid of this small bet from the strategy fully. Just use the big bet or check. What you can see happening here is that it's actually out of position for the most part. Who's doing well in terms of equity? We do have a little bit of an equity spike when it comes to some really good sort of top pair hands, because queen high boards are actually very good for the button. It's the most abundant Broadway. So we have a lot of queen X combos. We do quite well in that department, but then we don't have aces or kings, and that's what all the dots at the far right are there. It's just sorry, not the far right, but these dots here are going to be your opponent having like the bigger overpairs than you, and then at the very end you're going to have some sets and monstrous hands like pocket sixes that want to go ahead, or queen jack that want to go ahead and bet every single time effectively. But this range explorer graph's quite interesting because it shows that while small blind is doing well overall, button starts to do a bit better towards the nutty region, with the exception of this little bit here where aces and kings are more prevalent in small blind's range. But it's not going to be a nut disadvantage spot really. It's going to be a spot where we've got plenty of hands that want to bet big that are just top pair, 2-pair sets. We can do that with those and not bet anything else. So our bets are clearly distinguishable now between value and bluff. We have clear value bets, ace queen coming in at 77% equity, give or take. The reason that this equity is actually better than it looks is that a lot of the opponent's 24% equity here doesn't come from beating ace queen, which is a very hard thing to do, but comes from having flush draws, straight draws, gutters, overcard to the queen, etc. And then our bluffs like ace 5. This bluff is a bit on the dicey side, to be honest. It wouldn't take much of a swing in equity here of the pre-flop ranges to make this bluff a bad idea. The reason it's okay is, again, that the queen high flop just tends to be fairly okay for the button. It's not that disadvantageous a situation overall. We don't have a range advantage here overall, but we're not doing terribly either. If this was king jack 6 or king 10 6, it'd be a lot worse. Overall, the queen is the best Broadway for button in this matchup. The ace is the second best, and the king jack and 10 are all pretty horrific. Our homework today is to try to figure out which kind of float bet strategy, meaning polarization level, is it semi-polarized or fully polarized, we'll be adopting, and whether our range will be picking a big or small bet. Then I'd like you to go on and see how your hand applies within that model, just as we did before. We design the blueprint and then we see which part of the blueprint we currently hold. I'll give you a few minutes to complete this exercise, and I'll go over the answers. Okay, let's go over the answers. So, question 1, we have ace 5-3, blind versus blind. The ace on the board here is going to really remove a lot of the usefulness of the fold equity. It makes the board a bit higher. You could argue that we have like quite a lot of 5x and 3x here in cards with straight draws, more wheelie cards probably, meaning cards with wheel draws, than the small blind has. So equity wise, the spot won't be too bad. So we could bet semi often here. I would probably just opt for a big sizing here. You could probably go either way here. I don't mind actually betting some hands like 6s and 7s because there are some low cards on the board here, and these hands are a bit better therefore. So I don't mind using a small bet, but I think my main preference here would just be to build a fully polarized strategy for a big sizing due to the ace, making it a bit more of a way ahead, way behind spot, and then just crafting a betting range of good top pair plus and some bluffs. I think that's the simplest way to go here. Ace 8 is a hand that can value bet. It's strong enough to bet here. It's definitely not a must value bet. Whether you're using big or small sizing, it doesn't matter. It's never a pure value bet because the hand just doesn't crave big enough pots for it to have to bet. That said, it can bet, and it should go into your betting range sometimes. Question 2, 9-5 deuce. We are facing the check here from the small blind 3-better. Note that it says 3-bet pot at the top. With ace 5, we actually want to bet this hand a lot. I think it's quite useful to bet here. We get called by worse. We don't get better to fold, but we do get quite a lot of useful fold equity when we bet, so the denial factor to a hand like ace 5 is fairly high. As a low pair, the lower the pair, the higher the denial factor, usually. Question 3. King Jack 7 is a pretty gruesome board actually for button's range. It's much worse than the Queen Jack X that we looked at earlier. Typically the button is going to hate the King, the Jack and the 10 the most in 3-bet pots because these are cards that the small blind 3-bets at a way higher frequency than we call. We tend to 4-bet a lot of our lower offsuit broadways and flat our higher ones. So while we'll have a lot of King Queen, Ace Queen, we will not have a lot of King 10, King 9, King Jack, Jack 10, that sort of thing. Some suited ones, sure, but not in the offsuit format. So small blind has loads of like King 10 off, Face Jack off, way more often than we do. So they like this board a lot more than we do. That means we'll want to bet sparingly, and we may as well just build our betting range around the top of our range here, betting things like 7s, King Jack, King Queen, King 10, draws, other bluffs, gutters. We have some standards about what we're bluffing here on this board. I doubt we'd be betting the Ace 3 of clubs ever, but we would be betting a hand like Ace 10 with the Ace of spades. We don't have that, but any Ace 10 or 10-9 or whatever would be fine. Flush draws, etc. So with King Queen, I think we can bet. I don't think it's a must bet spot. I think it's okay to bet and okay to check, and I think that you want to make sure that you do protect your checking range a bit here and mix some check with King Queen. Maybe 7s is a mandatory bet, but I don't think top pair would fall into that category. Monotone boards, onto question 4, are notoriously polarizing. They neutralize the nut advantage a lot. Neither player really gets to have a big nut advantage on a monotone board. It's kind of like the police of flop textures that kind of kills the fun for everybody when it comes to the nuts, and polarizes both ranges. When your opponent's range is really polar, you want to bet smaller. It doesn't really make sense here, I don't think, for the big blind player to use large bets, so I would just be using a small bet here with a semi-polarized strategy, and Jack 8 is definitely a hand I can bluff. This is not an unfavourable spot for range, therefore you don't have to be too picky about where your bluffs are. You can bluff Jack 8. Hopefully you enjoyed this lecture, guys. Quite a lot to unpack. Another one to go over time and time again. Take notes, revise, watch it back. In the meantime, I will see you for lecture 9 and hope you're enjoying the course so far. Alright, bye for now.